Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you're joining us from, welcome. We thank you very much for joining us for this, the third in our series of Friday dialogues between WWF and the OECD on driving a green and resilient recovery. I'm Margaret Kuhlow, Finance Practice Leader and Interim Global Conservation Director at WWF. I'll be your host and moderator for the next 90 minutes or so. We have an inspiring keynote address from Canada's Finance Minister, Bill Morneau. We'll have an exciting interactive discussion with Martin Spolc, Head of Sustainable Finance in the Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Services and Capital Markets Union. That's the DG FISMA of the European Commission, and Eric Usher, Head of the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative. We'll also hear some closing remarks from our co-host, Masamichi, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD. We also want to hear from you over the course of this discussion. You can submit your questions for speakers in the Q&A tab you'll find along the bottom of your screen, and it'll be open throughout the session. Behind this webinar is a great team at the OECD and the WWF, and they'll try to answer some of your questions as we go, and I'll pose some of those questions directly to our speakers as well. We will be recording this session and we'll share it with all registrants by email within the next couple of days. You should feel free to tweet during the session using the hashtag #GreenRecoveryDialogues, and should you wish, you can add the OECD and WWF handles to your social media posts. As I mentioned, this is the third in our series of Friday dialogues on driving a green and resilient recovery. The first of our three joint dialogues focused on aligning the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, with a post-COVID-19 world. The postponement of this year's climate change conference in Glasgow to next year offers governments a crucial window to improve their national emissions plans and align them with citizen asks for a greener and more socially and environmentally resilient post-COVID society. The second in the series of our discussions examine the potential for nature-based solutions to support post-COVID-19 recovery. We learned that, for example, the International Labour Organization has estimated that where we can apply a local resource-based approach to recovery, labor intensity can be increased by as much as 35%. We also discussed landscape approaches, such as coastal recovery and forestry, and we learned that afforestation projects can have a double positive impact in climate vulnerable communities that also are really hard hit by the economic crisis, by both building climate resilience and bringing jobs. Today, we'll focus on the role of the finance sector in mobilizing a green and just recovery. The COVID-19 dual health and economic crises bring to the forefront fundamental questions about the role of governments in managing systemic risks and building resilience to such risks. Not only pandemics, but also climate change and biodiversity loss, which together will increase the incidences of zoonotic diseases, including those with pandemic potential, as well as those with significant disease burden, such as malaria and dengue fever. Governments with long-term vision can adopt a green and just recovery approach in order to direct and encourage investment in the economy to change the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions growth and to support investment in natural capital in order to make both nature and people healthier and more resilient. For example, finance ministers from 52 countries have come together in a coalition of finance ministers for climate action, including our next speaker, and committed to the Helsinki Principles, which explicitly encourage incorporation of climate change in fiscal planning and budgeting, and working towards measures that reduce fossil fuel subsidies and result in effective carbon pricing. And now's the time to put those principles into practice. It's my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Canada's Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau. Minister Morneau is the Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre and is also an accomplished business leader. As Canada's Minister of Finance since 2015, Minister Morneau has played a key role in shaping government policies and initiatives, including the introduction of the Canada Child Benefit, tax cuts for the middle class and small businesses, and the negotiation of an enhanced Canada pension plan. Before becoming minister, he led the human resources firm Morneau. Under his leadership, the firm grew from 200 to 4,000 employees, becoming the largest firm of its kind in Canada. As a community leader, he's worked to support the arts, help at-risk youth, and improve access to healthcare and education. Minister Morneau is co-author of The Real Retirement and previously served as pension investment advisor to the Ontario government. Minister Morneau, it's a pleasure to welcome here to talk to us today.
Well, let me start, Margaret, by thanking you very much for that, that kind introduction. I want to confirm that you can hear me. Good. Well, I'd like to say good morning to everyone who's in my time zone, at least, and recognize that many of you, it's later in the day. So for those of you joining from elsewhere, I hope you're having a good Friday. I want to thank the WWF and the OECD for arranging this series and for inviting me to join for this third and final event. And I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from the other people on this panel. I was invited this morning to speak about recent actions that Canada has taken in our plan to provide economic support to Canadians during the COVID-19 crisis that also support our climate goals, our long-term climate goals. I want to begin by giving you a snapshot of Canada's COVID-19 economic response plan. That's an important frame for our discussion. We've sought to be ambitious and comprehensive in our response, providing economic support that's worth more than 10% of our GDP. Our support has followed some key principles. We've wanted from the very outset to make sure, most importantly, that we're protecting Canadians' health. We also need, and we recognized early on that we needed to ensure that Canadians had access to enough funds to provide for essentials for them and their families. And of course, we want to make sure that we support our businesses so that they have the ability to get to the other side of this crisis and continue to be important in our economy and employing people. We've made very significant investments in our public health care systems, which in our case are delivered by our provincial and territorial governments. And we're investing in testing, tracing, and personal protective equipment, obviously, to ensure that we can continue to deal with this ongoing challenge. We've obviously recognized that the approach we've taken to public health has had severe impacts, severe economic impacts on people and on businesses. In our country, like others, thousands of businesses have had to shut their doors, and millions of Canadians have been laid off or their hours have been significantly reduced during this time period. We started out by introducing what has become the most important economic measure, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which provides about $2,000 a month to support individuals who've lost their income because of COVID-19. We were in Canada able to open up this very rapidly with a simple and straightforward application process, and it's rapidly delivered support to millions of Canadians. I think one of the things we've been most pleased with is the support has gotten out so quickly. When we look at the overall scale of the response in Canada, both officials in my department and the Bank of Canada estimate that this benefit and the other direct measures we've taken have effectively replaced most of the employment income that Canadians have lost during the pandemic up to now. And in particular, for low-income and vulnerable Canadians, the support has been critical in helping them to pay for their rent or their groceries or the day-to-day essentials. We also know that the impacts of COVID-19 have been disproportionately felt by women and by young people and by low-income Canadians. I think for the discussion today, these are also, in many cases, the groups most impacted by climate change, which I'd like to touch on in my comments. For businesses, we knew from the very start that they were going to need to have some liquidity support to get through this crisis. So what we did was we rolled out credit availability programs for small and medium-sized businesses and provided interest-free loans with a forgivable portion to the smallest of businesses. But we also recognize that the largest of firms in our economy, which employ millions of Canadians, also are likely to require, in many cases, bridge loans to get through this economic shock. So the program we released was what we call LEAF, the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility. It provides support to firms that have over $300 million in annual revenues and need support, need loans of $60 million or more. We designed this program to make sure that large companies that provide millions of jobs can get through the crisis. But we also wanted to make sure that Canadians' interests were being served, not only the short-term interests, but also the long-term interests. So companies that access support through this Large Employer Emergency Financing Initiative have to commit to a number of things. They have to commit to continuing to preserve employment. Most importantly, they need to be able to confirm to us that they're respecting collective bargaining agreements and protecting pensions. And to the subject of today's discussion, they have to publish annual climate-related disclosure reports that are consistent with our Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related disclosures, financial disclosures. So, you know, we've been very clear that we want to move forward on climate change, and Canadians have voted and told us that they want us to continue to fight climate change and continue to work hard to protect our environment. And our view is that just because we find ourselves in an emergency period doesn't mean we should lose sight of some of those very critical long-term goals. So we've been clear that we can't lose sight of the work that needs to be done to meet the Paris goals, which we've committed to. And importantly, we can't lose sight of the work that needs to be done to get to net zero by 2050. So our view is we'll need to continue to have measures that help us to build a greener and more resilient economy, and that we need to broaden this so that everyone in our society is playing their appropriate role. We know that the global economy, the global marketplace is seeing more and more investors factor environmental, social, and governance standards into their decision making. Our view is that we can't let Canadian firms fall behind in this regard. So we're making sure that firms have the right incentives to keep up with these evolving market demands. We started this a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, in the spring of 2018, our government commissioned an expert panel on sustainable finance that reported through to myself and to our environment minister. The panel identified that the task force on climate disclosures, consistent and comparable reporting standards, is a key way to get organizations to focus on the risks and the opportunities presented by climate change. And it's obviously enabling markets to do the same. In our most recent budget, which was now a while ago in 2019, our government announced support for these standards, and we enforced the use of these climate-related financial disclosures for appropriate crown corporations of the government, as well as for major Canadian companies. So this is a private sector-led approach, and we believe that the private sector is an essential partner for tackling climate change. We know that in Canada, our mix of financial expertise, innovation, and obviously our resource-rich economy means that we're one of the most well-positioned economies in the world to create best-in-class practices in this regard. We know that many Canadian firms are leading the way in finding cleaner, less carbon-intensive ways to develop resources, and that's critically important in this initiative. Many Canadian firms have already committed to disclosing climate risks, and this measure will encourage even more firms to be part of this shift towards the future. Our LEAF program, this large employer financing program, also requires recipients to report on how their future operations will support environmental sustainability and our national climate goals. We recognize that the world's in a period of transition in this regard towards a low carbon economy, and that for the resource sector in particular, the double hit of the pandemic and the collapse of oil prices has had a severe impact. So we had to think about how our economic response plan could support this sector, but also ensure that it had the funding to continue to reduce emissions. We, in some of our measures, we've actually focused directly on that. In April, we provided $750 million to create a new emissions reduction fund to help Canada's energy sector invest in projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This was in addition to significant investments to the cleanup of orphan and inactive wells. We put $1.7 billion into that effort, which obviously would help us with an environmental challenge, but also support thousands of Canadian workers and ensure that we'll end up with a cleaner and healthier environment. So, to conclude, when we look at resilience, we need to know that we're thinking not in terms of months, but in terms of years and decades. Every country needs to lay down responsibility tracks for the next generations, the generations that follow us. We know that it's our most vulnerable people, women, low-income people, Indigenous people in the case of Canada, and young people who are the most impacted by climate change. So our ongoing commitment as a government will be to continue to make investments to create a healthier, more resilient, and more equitable future. As we're beginning to move towards what we call a safe restart for our economy and begin planning for the future that lies ahead, we know that any plan needs to also have deep consideration of how we are going to tackle climate change. Confronting climate change, from our perspective, is much like what we're facing in this pandemic. It's global in nature, and we need to face the fact that we're all in this together. So we, Canada, will continue to work with partners at all levels, international, in our country, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous, as well as with the private sector, to forge a path that leaves no one behind and builds a greener economy that will be resilient for years to come. So thank you for hearing me out this morning, and I look forward to our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Minister Morneau, and thanks for leading by example in this case. Help us to understand, I have a couple questions for you. Help us to understand how you decided to make access to that LEAF facility, the large employer facility, contingent on disclosing climate risks in accordance with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures recommendations. What goes into making a decision like that, and what advice do you have for other finance ministers who are considering this, or maybe even other finance ministers who aren't yet considering it, to how you work through that sort of a recommendation in the context of real pressure to get emergency support out to the economy?
Well, thank you. I think the starting point is obviously that we have been working on this for years. So we had set up a framework to think about how we about their long-term climate impact are much more likely to be able to get a following for those initiatives in the market. Provide support so that you can continue to be successful after this pandemic, which means we're actually focused on the long term by definition. We needed to make sure that we also had this as we evaluated the conditions required for any government financing, we knew we needed to have Canadians support we are on board for any decisions firms so we build what was important. Facing climate challenges. So that additionally was an important factor for us, and important in thinking about the long-term support for this measure. Think about, because this pandemic is causing an immediate crisis, but it will cause some long-term damage and challenges for firms. So having the government commit to being there for the long term means we need to think about that that long term.
We have gotten a question in on that long-term question. Is it, and I think a lot of governments have faced this question, is it enough? Have you done enough? And also, how are you thinking about the post-COVID economy in general, and whether or not these types of disclosures, these types of this type of encouragement to firms to think about what their plans are through to 2050 will put you in a better place in a post-COVID economy?
Well, I think the clear answer is that asking firms to report on their climate issues is important, but not sufficient in terms of addressing our climate change challenges. So we believe that the most important thing we can do is to continue to put a price on carbon. That is something that we've moved forward on as a government to get to a national approach to pricing carbon. During the course of this pandemic, we actually went forward with the scheduled increase on the price in carbon in April 2020. That we believe is important. There was obviously a push and pull on that decision from different actors within our economy, but we see that as an important long-term way for us to deal with our climate impact. So to the specific issue around this market-based approach, we do think that what it will do is it will encourage firms to recognize the climate issues they're going to face. And once they recognize those, of course, like any economic actor, to start to take action against those challenges, both action that will reduce their impact, but also action that might actually help their economic outcome from a capital raising standpoint because of the increasing awareness of this challenge, but also from the market looking at the goal. I mean, after all, a company is just a long-term opportunity for people to create financial advantage, and showing that there's financial advantage in being more climate resilient leads to the right kind of decisions. So as an important action, this was an opportunity for us to take that and make it more sustainable over time. And it supplements other things that we're doing that are likely to have a very important long-term impact, like pricing carbon.
Thank you. Maybe one last question for you, Mr. Minister, if you can stay one more minute. From our participants, what potential do you see in the G7 and the G20 for joint actions on green recovery?
I think, one of the challenges that this pandemic has presented to all of us is that we're all dealing with our health impacts first. And by definition, our health situation is different in different countries. So it has meant that the area of most immediate focus has been on that, and that has occupied a significant amount of our time. Now, that said, I think that both in the G7 and in the G20, there are a number of countries who are thinking about how we can respond and move forward after this. Certainly, those are discussions that I've had on an ongoing basis with my colleague from France, Bruno Le Maire, how we can respond and continue in our efforts to focus on a cleaner, greener economy coming out of this. But I think that will likely be an important discussion for upcoming meetings of the G7 and the G20 as we hopefully get into the next phase of responding to this pandemic. In Canada, we are still very much in the crisis, but we are starting to think about, as I mentioned, a safe restart. And that allows us to think about those next sets of investments. And I expect that those discussions will be enabled among G7 countries in upcoming meetings. And, to a certain extent in G20 countries, although it's a broader grouping with countries in very different situations. Obviously, even Canada and the US is in a different situation, but when you add Canada, US, and Brazil, and Japan, and China, you start to get a much broader range of situations. And so that might be somewhat more challenging, being realistic. But I do think you'll see some coordinated investment actions and likely some recognition that investment should incorporate our longer term climate goals.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Also, some good content for our panel discussion to come. You're welcome to say if you have some time. We also would like to thank you very much for your leadership on this issue, in particular to make sure to keep the future in focus at a time when really crucial, very quick decision-making needs to happen to respond to both the immediate health crisis and the immediate economic crisis. That's the outcome of the efforts to stem the spread of the health crisis. So thank you very much for continuing to keep this, the climate and what's our next set of crises and how we respond to those really front and center. Now, as we move to our panel discussion, I want to remind you you can submit your questions for panelists in the Q&A tab you find along the bottom of the screen. And let me again take a minute to introduce our panelists. So Martin Spolc is head of the Sustainable Finance Unit in the European Commission's Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Services, and Capital Markets Union. Again, this is DG FSMA. Previously, Martin was head of the Capital Markets Union Unit, the Economic Analysis Unit, Deputy Head of the Banking Unit, and Assistant to the Director General, directly involved in developing the Banking Union and other key projects in the area of financial services aimed at restoring financial stability after the last financial crisis. Before joining the Commission, Martin worked in risk management and banking. He's a CFA charter holder, so we know who to send all the difficult questions to, Martin. And he's also a member of the Global Association of Risk Professionals. It's really nice to see you again, and thank you for joining us today. We're also joined by Eric Usher, who heads the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI, a global partnership that brings together the UN and global groups of banks, insurers, and investors working together with the UN to further sustainable finance and responsible investment agendas. Over the years, UNEP-FI has established some of the most important sustainability-oriented platforms in the finance industry with the finance industry, including the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and most recently, the Principles for Responsible Banking. Since joining UNEP-FI in 2015, Eric's focused on accelerating the integration of sustainability risks into finance practice, including addressing climate change, natural capital loss, and human rights, as well as building out the framework for positive impact finance to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Eric sits on several industry bodies, including as UN representative on the board of the PRI and as member of the governing boards of the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, the UN Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the Investor Agenda, and the Impact Fund Rep Africa. Thank you, Eric, for joining us, and it's nice to see you again today. So Martin, let me start with you. This is an easy question, how can the European Union's Sustainable Finance Action Plan help deliver a green and just recovery to the dual crises of COVID?
Thank you very much, Margaret. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I hope that you can hear me well.
We can.
That's very good. Since you mentioned the green recovery, let me make one thing very, very clear and very straight. There have been some claims after the crisis started that sustainability is very important, but it's a very expensive agenda, and maybe we should put it aside and maybe wait a little bit and first resolve the problems of the crisis, and sustainability is for later. Well, I would like to make it very clear that the European Commission strongly disagrees with those claims, and on the contrary, we believe strongly that there is no trade-off between incentivizing a speedy economic recovery and supporting the sustainability transition. So here I would like to make it very clear that for us, the green agenda can indeed accelerate the recovery, and the recovery packages that we have adopted at the European Union level and member states level can also accelerate the green agenda. So for us, it's really, I mean, the sustainability transition remains clearly very high on our policy agenda, and it can be a very important source of economic and job opportunities. I hope that you have seen the big package that the European Union, the Commission presented on the 27th of May, which again puts the sustainable finance in the very heart of the response to the crisis. And there have been several references to sustainable finance in the package. Not only the importance of all the tools that we have developed so far, but in particular the role of taxonomy to support investments that are needed as a result of the crisis. As part of the package, we have also made it very clear how big the investment needs are, and just in the case of environmental needs, we have come to the conclusion that we would need, in addition, almost half a trillion of euros every year, in addition to the investments that have been already envisaged and earmarked. So it's clear that this money cannot be serviced and filled only by public interventions, and we do need to unlock private capital. And all these public packages and public stimulus that we have seen at both member states levels and European Union can really unlock additional investments. You might recall now, I mean, I will go a little bit into the detail of the action plan. You might recall that there have been 3 objectives, and the first one was to make sure that we provide the right tools and frameworks to investors to reorient capital flows towards sustainability, towards environmental, social, and governance objectives. And there were several tools that we have presented on which we have been working very hard. I will just mention maybe 3 of them. The first one is taxonomy. For us, the taxonomy is a super relevant and useful tool and instrument that can be used by anybody, not only by investors and the private sector, but also by the public authorities, by member states, by the European Union, to guide these investments towards economic environmental sustainability. As you know, the taxonomy concept defined 6 environmental objectives. The first 2 are climate related, and before the end of the year, we will enshrine the substance of those climate taxonomies into EU law. And then the other 4 environmental objectives are related to other very important environmental objectives: circular economy, prevention of pollution, protection of water, and biodiversity. And we will enshrine the environmental taxonomies into our EU law 1 year later, before the end of next year. So again, this taxonomy for us is really a key tool, and this was also clearly recognized in the public documents that were published by the Commission, that taxonomy should be really the guiding tool and principle for all these investments. The second example, I don't want to take too much time, is the EU Green Bond Standard. It's an excellent example how investors and also businesses, issuers, can use this instrument to green and make greener sectors and companies that are currently making even a negative environmental footprint, but they would simply improve their way of production and make the environmental footprint significantly lower. Another instrument which is very promising, and it will enter into force already this year, is the climate benchmarks, which basically allow investors to invest into stocks that would ultimately have a plan for decarbonization or are already Paris aligned. Finally, I would like to mention a measure on which we are consulting as we speak, that we also hope to trigger a big move and big shift of investments, and especially mobilized retail investors. We are consulting now on a measure that would require investment advisors to ask retail investors about their preferences, whether they have environmental, social, or governance preferences. And if this is the case, if a retail investor says, yes, I would like to invest my money in certain environmentally positive way, or also I would like to avoid that my money makes a negative impact, then the investment advisors have to follow up accordingly. And finally, I mean, I should certainly mention all these public stimulus and packages that again provide a large-scale opportunity for many investors, businesses to unlock new opportunities and investments in the right direction. I think that I will stop. I have been already very long in my answer.
Thank you very much. A question for you on the taxonomy, sort of a two-part question on the taxonomy. So there's, what do you think is the role of the taxonomy in delivering a sustainable and just recovery? Is it enough to have strong definition of what counts as green to avoid greenwashing, I think with very good intent, without a clear definition of what counts as brown? So how do you think about the potential additional public resources going to heavy emitting sectors that wouldn't be caught in the definitions in the taxonomy because they're not green, and as part of the response to the recovery from COVID-19? And what kinds of, in addition to the signaling to the public sector, how does that signal to the private sector the sort of absence of the definitions and the better accounting on the investments that go into the heavy emitting sectors?
Thank you, Margaret. It's an excellent question. First of all, I should recall that the concept of taxonomy is built on two main concepts. First, the economic activity that would be eligible would have to substantially contribute to meeting the environmental objectives. That's the first condition. But the second condition that can be very pertinent and very useful in the current context is the do not significant harm principle. Do not harm. And if you have read the documents presented by the European Commission on the 27th of May very, very carefully, you didn't find references to taxonomy only, but we also found references to the do not harm. So although we don't necessarily have in every single document reference to taxonomy, there is an overarching principle in our package, which is that the public interventions and the ultimate investments that these interventions should trigger should not create harm. And that's really the main and basic condition that we need to apply everywhere. Now, we can obviously go further. And if your question is, do we need a brown taxonomy? Do we need to go further? Well, in the taxonomy regulation negotiations, the Parliament and the member states agreed on a review clause that require that the Commission will present before the end of next year a report that would basically explore the merits of extending the taxonomy into also environmentally harmful economic activities, into a list of activities that would significantly harm environmental objectives. I should say that we have already started to work on it. You have seen very likely the public consultation on the renewed sustainable finance strategy. There are some questions asked about this issue. And by the way, we have just received 2 days ago a response from the European Central Bank, and the supervisors are in general calling for acceleration of this work at the European Union level. We have not yet made a decision ourselves. Again, we have to still comply with the regulatory requirements of the taxonomy regulation. We also have to finish the first step, which is finalizing the green taxonomy, which will still take time. But we will need to consider very seriously all these responses that we will receive in the consultation.
Thank you. A two-part question. So, what do you think is the role of the recovery packages, the support packages in promoting job production, and how much are you looking at green job production in particular? And then a separate, not entirely related question, these are both from the audience. Given likely significant write-downs, which will be required in the energy sector to reflect a realistic valuation of large corporate assets if they assume liability for likely higher carbon price, are European banks adequately capitalized?
Mm-hmm. Well, on the job generation, well, the package that was presented on the 27th of May presented an envelope of approximately 1.8 trillion euros. That would be either distributed, to member states in the forms of grants or loans, and of course also through the EU instruments. So this amount of money, again, will have to be provided in a way, and has been also designed in a way, that should trigger investments and new opportunities that the European economy hasn't had a chance to reap yet. Again, we have clearly seen that there was a significant drop in investments due to the crisis, and there is a lot of cash now, and there is a lot of really a great opportunity now to start basically kicking the economy and unlock economic growth through this stimulus. So we believe that the different packages, I will not go into the details, in the different sectors, and again the role of taxonomy and of other instruments can really significantly steer investments into new sectors and make them greener. That's really the most important thing. I should have said that the role of the tools and frameworks that we are developing in sustainable finance is to help the existing industries that are currently having negative environmental footprint to transition towards sustainability and to make them greener. That's really very important. On your second question, whether banks are sufficiently capitalized to withstand essentially other types of risks or risks stemming from the different crises that we might see in the future, and I would add even the interaction of those different crises. We should also envisage how these different crises and risks might interact with each other. We should not underestimate that. Well, that's something that many people are looking at, many experts are looking at. In the renewed sustainable finance strategy, we have presented a very important block in our consultation that is dealing with the risks. I would mention two important stakeholders in this discussion. The first one is the Network for Greening Financial System, which is very successful, and we are really learning a lot from their work, which is exploring what the supervisors need to do to push the banks and the financial market participants more broadly to make sure that they are resilient and that they are able to withstand possible future crises. There is currently a work that is being done by the European Banking Authority that is exploring not only better understanding how bad the situation is, what is the scale of the problem, but also is exploring a possibility that supervisors might apply possible capital surcharge under Pillar 2 to banks that might have on their balance sheets exposures that might prove to be unsustainable, especially over the medium to long term. So this work is ongoing. We are asking very many questions on this in the third block of our consultation. I don't want to already preempt the answer to this, but those of you who are interested to contribute, we would certainly welcome your input.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to you in a minute with a question on investing in nature itself as part of our resilience agenda. But I want to take a minute to go to Eric first on this line of discussion about climate specifically and how we incorporate climate considerations into the financial packages. Eric, what do you think? You spend a lot of time with groups of banks, investors, insurers on sustainability issues. What have you been hearing from them in terms of the packages coming out of the governments, and what's their perspective on how these packages can be more green, more just, more focused on longer term responses to the crisis and the crisis that is still coming in terms of the physical impacts that are already and will be hitting us even more acutely from climate change?
Great. Well, thanks very much, Margaret, and thanks to WWF and OECD for the invitation to join today. I think obviously it's hard to find good news in today's environment, but I think at least the neutral news, if I can say, is that the financial system has shown itself capable of meeting the emergency requirements of keeping the economy running in this situation. And I think credit for that goes to the regulators, the Fed and many other central banks who have ensured liquidity into the system, and that's allowed the banks and other financial actors to put in place emergency measures to maintain liquidity, to maintain working capital that businesses need to operate. And there's no question that the financial system is stable today. There's no question that it's doing its basic job. Now, the question you're asking really is, so as we start to look forward, once again, will the financial system, what role can it play in building back better, or whatever terminology you use? I would like to point out the Network for Greening the Financial System that Martin mentioned. They put out a COVID statement, I think it was last week, where they referred to the pandemic being a real-life stress test of what we could potentially experience in increasingly unstable climate or disorderly transition shock. And therefore, I think another positive aspect is coming back to what Martin started. The point of question is sustainability. Is that something we have the time to look at today? What we're seeing across the financial sector is absolutely, in the extent that COVID response, dealing with pandemics, resilience overall is basically seen as part of the sustainability preparations of institutions. It's not a separate topic. And to some extent, preparations, I think, towards sustainability challenges have helped them prepare. There is a lot of comparisons today to talk about the resilience of systems, of economies, of institutions, and the fact that those who have not put in place the proper buffers have shown themselves to perform more poorly in the current market condition. I think one of the big positives, or another one, compared to the great financial crisis of 10 years ago, was in terms of the supervisory regulatory response. First of all, they were slower that time, they're faster this time, but very importantly, the way in which they talk about the need to green the recovery or sustainability considerations today, we're hearing from the NGSS, but from the IMF, from the European Central Bank and others, was totally unheard of 10 years ago. And so the notion within the financial system has a role in addressing sustainability challenges, that is new. And I think that is promising. But now, obviously, the big challenge awaits, and essentially, particularly focused around, will the stimulus be green or not? And I think some of the numbers that are out there so far don't actually look that promising, and of capital allocated for stimulus, not that much of it is really green-oriented or sustainability-oriented, although I think a lot of it is the devil in detail. A lot of it is just emergency funding, which is not specific to how it's used. It's just basically to keep the lights on. But there is definitely, I hope, more work that can be done to increase the level of commitment of the type we heard from Minister Morneau, to dedicate it or to some extent tie stimulus to specific sustainability objectives or outcome. Pre-COVID, one of the biggest concerns within OECD markets, at least, was low growth. We had gone through a post-war period leading up to the 1990s, really, where we had 50 years of rebuilding economies, high growth, rising middle class, decreasing inequality, and that essentially petered out in the 90s. And since then, endemic low growth. And as if you read Piketty or others, they basically say low growth means increasing returns to capital, decreasing returns to labor, widening of the wage gap, and increasing wealth inequality. This is something that is being struggled with and including to the protests around inequality that have been set off in recent weeks through the tragic killing in the United States. So part of the question around the COVID recovery is, do we have a chance to create a post-war period of growth and prosperity? And with COVID, we know we need to rebuild the economy. Many governments have committed the stimulus to do this, but the challenge is the infrastructure already exists. And as different from the post-war period, we're not building from a blank slate. We're building from a slate that has a lot of infrastructure that's built, that has a lot of brown, or largely brown facets to it. So how do we build more green? And so once again, as a question you raised to Martin, is it's not only about investing in renewables, which we need more of, and very importantly, and more green, it's also how do you start thinking about decommissioning the brown? And who needs to share the cost? Where's the exposure? What will that do to balance sheets and the like? I think another dimension that's quite important about if we are going to make that shift to brown to green, almost all green technologies are higher capital intensive and lower operating costs. Think of renewables, for example. And therefore, the role of the financial sector becomes much more key. And so we are going to rely more on banking and finance more widely than we have with the brown economy. And therefore, we need to really get it right. And we know and have been struggling for quite some years around the challenge of the response to the last crisis. Although it made the banks more stable, it also deleveraged them, and it basically made it harder for them to do long-term financing. Now, Martin would have very much worked on this issue about how do we ensure that banks and other actors can provide the long-term type of financing needed for green infrastructure development. Going beyond the term of the financing, the big step up we're seeing today is the shift from disclosure, and we heard from Minister Morneau, and very interesting, the approach that's being taken in Canada to help make it mandatory to disclose on climate-related risks. We've seen a lot of growth in green bonds. We're seeing growth in engagement between investors and corporates, and we have the Climate Action 100 Plus, which has made good progress there. However, what we were lacking until very, very recently is how you tie all of these together, and essentially portfolio alignment, so that you can see as a business strategy, where are we going with all of this? And if you don't have portfolio-wide objectives, essentially financial institutions are going to be fiddling at the edges. Now, they're going to be issuing more green bonds on the margins, but continuing with an overall bond portfolio, which remains mostly brown. So we are starting to see some portfolio alignment leadership coming from the financial sector and also from governments. And this is kind of the push towards net zero. We have this Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit last September. We really appreciate that WWF is one of the very important actors involved in convening and working with leaders in the investment community. We have about 4.6 trillion of investors committed so far to going to net zero. That's 4.6 trillion. It's roughly the size of the German economy. So it's somewhat equivalent to the German economy committing to net zero, but specifically coming from the investor perspective. And we're seeing increasingly number of commitments to going net zero by 2050. That's all good, although we all know if that's all you do and then you go back to business as usual, it doesn't mean that much. Very importantly, this group is saying we're targeting 2050, but that means we're going to actually need 5-year milestones. And they're actually getting ready now to release their first target for 2025. I believe it will be announced at COP26, or it could be earlier, where they will basically say we are initially expecting to have to reduce so much by 2025, because that's the first step getting us towards zero. This group has made it very clear that their strategy is mostly about engagement with the corporations that they own, and it's about emissions reductions in the real economy. So it's not simply about in secondary markets, essentially pushing on the emissions to another investor. It's really to say, how can we get corporates to change themselves to reduce directly their emissions? It's also very important, it's about getting started even when the data quality and alignment methodologies aren't completely clear. I mean, we have to be perfectly frank. There are many reasons that you can look and say, there's just not enough clarity in the data today to do anything. And we can basically say, we need to wait. And we all know that we don't have the time to wait. And so this is the group, and we're starting to increasingly see these alliances or groups of actors who basically say, we need to learn by doing. We need safe spaces where we can develop and learn from what we do. But we need to get started today. This group of investors, and it includes most of the larger European insurers, Allianz, Swiss Re, Munich Re, just like that. Some of the largest pension funds, including CalPERS, in largest pension fund in the US, CDPQ, second largest in Canada, and others who are working together. They've set this common alignment commitment, and they're saying, how are we going to get there? And their main tool is to apply sectoral transition pathways to how they engage with companies they own. So this means, for example, for the, let's say, the steel sector, it means together they're figuring out how can the steel industry transition to net zero. You can use, for instance, science-based targets or other approaches to come up with essentially a baseline of what the steel industry is going to have to go through as an industry. And then they use this baseline to work with the companies to own to basically say, we want you to be outperforming this baseline. And if not so, potentially, first we will vote at our shares, essentially, and eventually we might have to divest if you're not getting onto this pathway to net zero. I think this is partially indicative that when we talk about climate finance mobilization, it's not necessarily about mobilizing dollars or rupees. It's really about mobilizing influence, what we call active ownership within the financial industry. It's about getting the economy to change. It's not simply about moving your capital to a place that maybe is greener, but leaving what you've left behind in its brown form with no influence. On the banking side, we're also working with a group of signatories to the Principles of Responsible Banking. There's 38 banks globally are working in a similar fashion to align their loan portfolios with the Paris objective. And once again, this includes a lot of methodological work, but it's around the same idea that we don't have all the details, but we realize the need strategically at the board level within organizations to start to forge this pathway forward towards net zero or towards alignment with the Paris objectives. And we don't have time to wait until we have the perfect, let's get going with the good. I'll stop at that, Margaret.
Yeah, thank you. So many good points there. I want to follow up on all of them. There are a number of questions in the Q&A about the role of the finance sector now in this, both with respect to the COVID-19 recovery and with respect to climate. And you touched on a lot of those points there. Is very helpful. I want to go to a question about just transition to both of you. So you've both talked about in different ways the need to decommission brown assets, the fact that what's happening in the finance sector, for example, with the Network for Greening the Financial System, network of central banks and financial regulators, potentially making it more expensive to hold or finance brown assets. You have at the same time this economic crisis post-COVID, which is a significant job crisis. And how do those two things come together? How do you think about making sure that call it the just transition from COVID-19 and also the just transition on carbon issues doesn't leave behind the people who will be impacted by the major adjustments that are coming in these industries? Now, of course, this discussion is all about who's impacted, right? The impacts of both COVID-19 and on climate hit, as Minister Morneau mentioned, the most vulnerable in our economies, the poorest, and women, indigenous peoples, various minority groups. We're also going to see job impacts from the climate transition. So how do you both think about, in your various work, shoring up the communities that are hit the hardest? Martin, why don't you start?
So thank you very much, Margaret. I will say there are two things to this question. The first one is we in the European Commission have obviously defined as a top priority the European Green Deal, but we have always made it very clear that there are significant challenges stemming from the transition towards climate neutrality and towards all these ambitious targets. Now, that's also the reason when we adopted, for instance, the first package of the, we call it the Green Deal investment plan or Sustainable Europe investment plan, at the same time, we also supported this package by so-called Just Transition Fund, which is an instrument that is precisely designed to support those parts of societies and citizens that would be badly affected by the transition, and we have to be aware that some parts of societies will be affected more than the others. So we have made it very clear that the Green Deal, European Green Deal, is not only about green, it's also about S. And by the way, the sustainability agenda is also about G, which is linked to also S and G by definition. So in a way, the sustainability agenda, and also the beauty of the sustainable finance in a way, and also the beauty of the concept of taxonomy, which I mentioned earlier, that if we want to fix something, we have to make sure that we are not harming something else, and we are still supporting also the social aspects of sustainability. So that also applies here. I mentioned this first example of the Just Transition Fund that is currently being negotiated by member states and the European Parliament. The second example that I would like to give you is in the recovery package. The recovery package, I mentioned the magic number 1.8 trillion, and there are different instruments that are being used. To give you an example, there is obviously the InvestEU instrument, which is being used to support investments in our economy, and there, I mean, it's logical to expect some links also with EU taxonomy. Now, there are other instruments such as solvency support instrument, which is designed to help companies that have been particularly badly hit due to the crisis, and that they not only need, I mean, support in terms of investment support, but in support in terms of equity, so that they can actually survive, if you wish, I mean, to stop the bleeding. And there, I mean, you cannot impose a super tight conditionality, because, I mean, it would be really undermining the effectiveness of this tool, and it might ultimately harm certain groups of our society. So of course, there are some references to minimum social safeguards and minimum environmental safeguards, even for the solvency support instrument. And there are also safeguards in terms of that companies that operate in environmentally harmful sectors, they should be encouraged to develop transition plans in the future. So some kind of hints to some kind of conditionality are there, but we have to make sure that we are not overdoing it either, because this type of instrument has been designed in the first place to support those who have been badly hit in the first place, and that might, if they are not supported, might have ultimately huge consequences on a number of people. And sustainability agenda is, again, the Green Deal agenda is not only about green, it's really also about making sure that the transition is smooth, orderly, and that ultimately that citizens embrace this agenda. It would be very bad if parts of our society, and not only in the European Union, but elsewhere, would feel that, you know, that the European Union is just favoring only parts of the pack. So maybe last point, I mean, I would like to mention is this is not only about the European Union. I think that we have to also discuss collectively, and the minister already alluded to it, and your question already hinted to the need to discuss how this agenda and the sustainable finance agenda and the responses to the recovery or the recovery packages responding to the crisis can support emerging markets and developing countries that have been particularly hit by the crisis, and at the same time they face the most significant challenges stemming from transition. And this agenda, the one on which I am working, sustainable finance, has a great potential to support those countries if there is a will of the developed countries to design certain concepts, methods, and architecture that could help those countries on their transition path. I mean, we are of course discussing now everywhere how to face the challenge of all the debt that these developing countries have, and whether, you know, there could be a possibility, I'm not obviously committing to anything, whether there could be a possibility of restructuring the debt rather than, you know, deferring the debt. And of course, if some also environmental aspects cannot be integrated into these considerations. There are considerations and there are discussions ongoing, and we need to really have a little bit more creative mindset for resolving those issues. That's also the reason why in our consultation on sustainable finance, we are mentioning the international dimension. We are mentioning the dimension of developing countries and emerging markets, and linking it with the environmental sustainability as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to come back to that question in a minute on the environmental issues as well. Eric, to you on the just transition question.
I mean, I think Martin's hit a lot of it. This is, the just transition is about jobs, good jobs, fair and decent work. I think one of the challenges is how do we create new industries that create good jobs? Because we can't, it's not obvious that new jobs, new industries automatically mean better jobs. And I think, and a lot of this has to do with the relationship between labor and capital, and the role of policymaking in essentially helping underlie. I mean, one of the things we have to appreciate is a lot of jobs in the brown economy actually are pretty good jobs, or at least they provide certain types of benefits that the new jobs don't necessarily provide. I think in terms of who's got to do that, banks play an important, particularly important role. You know, investment capital markets moves capital more quickly. And for instance, in the coal sector, there's not that much new investment going in for very good reasons, and I'm more thankful for that. Banks more typically, their interface with the coal economy will be to finance coal communities. And banks don't exit communities in the same way that investors do. In a lot of their client interface is where a lot of their value is. So their challenge is essentially in these communities, how do we work with these communities to get them onto new models of economic development? It will be, once again, it's partially about obviously the type of finance you provide, but it's very much about how do you navigate the relationship that you have. And once again, not only the banks, it's also, there's public policy behind that. The capital commitments that have come in, for instance, from the European Union are very important. And we're seeing in certain places some important impacts. I would say from my home country of Canada, and where Mr. Morneau has spoken from, there are big challenges. And it's just the discussions, I think, are at early stages there. But we're important hearing, you know, some of the important signals about how do you, it's not necessarily a simplistic issue that capital will move quickly. It's, you have to move the jobs as well. You have to create the good quality jobs that will be required. I'll stop at that.
All right, thanks. I want to go now to the environmental question. So we know this pandemic is the result of the way we human beings interact with the natural world around us. Deforestation, expansion, and intensification of agriculture, and how we use wildlife are the same drivers that give risks to the disruptions in climate, loss of biodiversity, and the increase in frequency and severity of zoonotic diseases, including those that go pandemic. So restoration and protection of nature must be an essential component of the global COVID-19 response. It's necessary to ensure human health and prosperous societies, and also to prevent future global health crises, and to build resilience to the impacts of climate change, including vector-borne zoonoses. So what kinds of policies do we need to support investment in nature and the natural systems we rely on for our own health and our prosperity, and to discourage finance and investment in those activities that undermine those critical systems? I think for the first time, really, the finance sector is grappling with that. We've got the example, we've been talking about deforestation for years. Now we have an example front and center. This is what happens when these systems don't operate in balance with each other. Eric, why don't I go to you first on that, and then to Martin.
Thanks very much, Margaret. And I think you know, almost all recent pandemics have originated from animals, but we do certainly know that human activity is the main culprit in spreading the disease. Back a couple of years ago in 2016, UNEP published the Frontiers report, and there it reported that 60% of all known infectious diseases in humans are zoonotic, those which are transmitted between vertebrate animals and people. The transition pathways of these diseases from animals to humans are not entirely clear, as we're hearing regularly in the news now. But we do, I mean, never before have we seen so much opportunity for pathogens to pass from wild and domestic animals to people. That we know. And so definitely the health of our planet plays an important role in the spread of zoonotic diseases. So as we look towards post crisis, we're certainly going to need a fairly ambitious line of inquiry into zoonotic diseases and the linkages to ecosystem health, and encroachment by croplands onto wildlife habitats is going to be a major factor in bringing people. into dangerous conflict with wildlife. We know that. And so we need to better understand the notion of, for instance, how competitive land use options would allow us to be able to keep wild spaces wild one way or another. We also need to look at wildlife trade, illegal trade in wildlife, and how that can be reduced. That's considered the fourth largest global crime today. I think there has been a scale up of focus, and 2020 was supposed to be the super year for nature, where a lot of these issues will be considered. As with climate and other areas, it has been delayed, but there certainly is an increasing focus. We're working with our members and trying to understand what it means, for instance, to have banking portfolios where you have zero impact on nature. Once again, we don't have the answers, but we've started to ask the questions and discuss what sort of methodologies would you use. So I do think the combination of the scaling up in climate awareness and to some extent action, the COVID crisis are coming together to really hopefully provide a lot more focus on nature, both how we impact on it and how degradation in our natural systems impact on our ability to operate as per or in a way that is prosperous, both economically and sustainability terms.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we had a great discussion in the last dialogue on nature-based solutions for climate as well. So there's really an opportunity to double down on investing in rebuilding for resilience for lots of reasons. Martin, last word to you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Well, I would like to mention two things. First of all, yes, we have done a lot on the climate side. Obviously, the action plan focused on all three letters, E, S, and G. But we have prioritized climate. I mean, that's clear. Now, this crisis has really clearly shown to us that we have to accelerate our work on E, I mean, broader environmental objectives, and it's already envisaged anyway for next year for taxonomy, but also beyond E and S and G. I should say that the regulatory approach that we have taken so far in the European Union has been focused on the disclosure of how the risks stemming from climate and environmental degradation are being managed by the financial sector. And there we have also incorporated some disclosure requirements on the impact of the activities of the companies and the portfolios, the financial market participants on climate and environment. Now, this second disclosure on the impact has started to be expanded from the original focus on the positive impact, essentially how much you use taxonomy, to what extent you use taxonomy, into disclosure of adverse impact. The disclosure regulation that requires financial market participants to disclose not only how they have reached the conclusion that their products are sustainable, but in the disclosure regulation, it's also required from the financial sector to disclose any principal adverse impacts. And that's very important. We believe that I mean, you said, Eric, I mean, that obviously all these problems are ultimately stemming from human activities. And we need to understand better, not only, again, the positive contribution, but also where the negative contribution, where the harm is being created. And that's why the upcoming review of the non-financial reporting directive that will bring much more and greater transparency for investors, who is actually doing what, and not only in terms of positive contributions, but what is the environmental footprint, what is the climate footprint, what is the footprint on nature more broadly of companies, of the big listed companies, and we are currently discussing the exact scope of these requirements, what it is, so that investors actually can have a better understanding, not only of the impact on climate, but of what is the impact of the business's operations on environment more broadly. We are discussing particular issues such as biodiversity. We need to work very closely with investors, and I think that Eric and many stakeholders are doing a great job to promote the debate on, and by the way, WWF in the first place, on biodiversity and the connection between biodiversity and finance. We have referenced some important work in our public consultation, and we are asking questions on this. So we do want to get your ideas, what needs to be done more. And here we also are discussing whether the financial sector will do what they will do now with climate, whether they will do it enough on the broader environmental objectives, what we are expecting them to do on climate. Climate has been already kind of embraced as something, we are not yet there, but certainly not. But I think that we have made some progress on the climate. Where I see a big gap is in the awareness of investors and the financial sector to understand how the loss of biodiversity can have a negative impact on the companies in which they invest, and also, by the way, on the negative impact of the companies on the loss of biodiversity. So I mean, both ways we are having these two angles enshrined in our European framework. I mean, the non-financial reporting directive is working with this double materiality concept, and we will continue to do so. There we are going beyond the TCFD, by the way. I mean, this is a novelty in the European Union. We are examining not only the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on the companies, but also the impact of companies on climate and environment. And my final point, I mean, Margaret, you mentioned it as well. This crisis has clearly shown to us that we need to do much more to understand the implications of these different crises and interactions of those different crises, and the degree of resilience, not only of the financial sector, but the degree of resilience of the businesses and our economy to be able to withstand any future crisis. And so far we have been looking at the risk side from the point of view of individual institutions, but we need to look at the risk side from the systemic point of view. And again, not only in the European Union, you know, I mean, what certain issues might entail in one member state or in the European Union, but what it means globally. The pandemic crisis has clearly shown how interacted the world is. And that's why also we need to work very closely with our international partners and developing countries and emerging markets. I will stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, and your and thanks also for the highlight of this work on biodiversity in finance. We have been working at WWF with a number of partners to call for a task force on nature impact disclosure, similar to the work on the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. And what's really interesting is it's hard to know what the financial impacts are if you don't, in the first instance, know what the environmental impacts are of the corporate, both impacts on the business of nature loss and impacts of the business, the impacts that the business has on nature loss. So in both directions. I'd like to thank you both for participating with us today and for your leadership on these issues. And on that note, on biodiversity finance, our partner organization OECD also is doing a considerable amount of work on biodiversity finance. And I'd like to thank the OECD for working with us on this first series of dialogues. In a moment, I'll introduce Mr. Masamichi Kuhlow, the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, to share some closing remarks on this webinar. And after he talks, Vanessa Perez-Herrera, the Deputy Leader of WWF's Climate and Energy Practice, will give a short wrap-up of the key takeaways of the first series and introduce you to the next series of these joint dialogues. So Mr. Masamichi Kuhlow was appointed Deputy Secretary General of the OECD in August 2017. His portfolio includes OECD policy on environment, green growth, and financial and enterprise affairs. He also represents the OECD at the Financial Stability Board, the home of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. He has a long career in financial supervision and regulation of financial services in Japan and globally. He was Vice Minister for International Affairs at the Japanese Financial Services Agency prior to his appointment at the OECD. He also served as chairman of the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO's technical committee, and also as chair of the IOSCO board. He was co-chair of the FSB Regional Consultative Group for Asia and chairman in the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board. He has also served as secretary of the World Trade Organization's Trade and Financial Services Committee. So certainly lots of work in all of these areas. And we really thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Kuhlow.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. Can you hear me? Oh, yes. And
yes, we can.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. It was probably too kind, but a great honor and pleasure to be here with you representing the OECD. My first great thanks to WWF for your great collaboration to enable this series of really rich dialogue. And it's really been a fascinating discussion. So in fact, I should have started by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening. But again, thank you for all the participants for having participated in this series of discussions. And just to close this, well, each of you will have your own takeaways, so I won't try to really sum up the extremely rich content of the discussions, but just to try to put some things in context for your further thoughts. And if you will remember, as recently as December of last year, we were really looking forward to embarking on a decade of action in support of our climate and sustainable development goals. And we realized that only 10 years remained to cut emissions by nearly half if we were to have a chance of limiting global warming to something like 1.5 degrees. And there was also a need to really accelerate action to stem biodiversity loss because of the mass extinctions, etc. And then we find that this COVID crisis come, and now what has happened is that, of course, the world has been profoundly changed by this pandemic. But as actually, I think this was Eric who mentioned that actually this the propagation of this novel disease really demonstrated that the way of life, our ways of life, really increased the likelihood of such a propagation or such diseases, and that we really have to draw lessons from this. And of course, we've seen those massive demand and supply side shocks, financial market turbulence, and then diminished risk appetite of investors, and really the crushing effects on jobs and economic growth. And the OECD just published its latest economic outlook, which really showed a very sobering picture. And by the end of 2021, for example, the loss of income exceeds that of any previous recession over the last 100 years, except war times, with severe and long-lasting consequences for the people. But so this actually aggravated or made it even more challenging to fight the climate and the biodiversity crises that we had in the beginning. And now we have to take measures to face both the global challenges of climate change, biodiversity, and the need to recover from this unprecedented health and economic crisis. And so absolutely we cannot consider them separately. We can't just wait for one phase to go before tackling the other. And if we don't actually deal with them together now, future generations will have to really endure a protracted economic and financial downturn at the same time as increasingly frequent and severe environmental emergencies. So let's say we have this challenge, and then we are already talking about, of course, a recovery in the sense that some restrictions are now beginning to be relaxed in many countries, and governments are putting in place measures to support sustainable growth. I mean, well, to be fair, of course, we have to say, we can say that the scale and the speed of the various policy measures taken to limit the social and economic impacts of the crisis have so far been impressive. But how do we address the challenges of climate change, biodiversity, and the other environmental issues, along with this challenge of enabling a recovery, is the key question. And certainly we heard from many experts on how governments are trying to deal with them, how the international community, the markets, investors, they're all coping with this challenge. But one thing is for sure, that we need to scale up sustainable finance far beyond what we have had now, or what we were envisaging before this crisis, when, of course, investment is actually falling dramatically in many countries. So we are really in a really difficult situation, and I have to admit that. But let's say, well, drawing, of course, lessons from the crisis already, I think there is a silver lining, and there are opportunities that come. Actually, there are already new businesses, new behaviors that are promising in terms of addressing the sustainability issue together with economic recovery and development. And again, we have to be conscious that if we don't act now, future generations will have to again bear the burden of huge debt, huge damage from the crisis into the future, well into the future. And what, of course, when we talk about the investment, we have to be very conscious that the investments we make now will certainly affect the future, and in terms of economic activity and behavior, and that if we do bad investments now, then of course that will lock in unsustainable practices, unsustainable behavior. And so we have to think wisely. We need smart policy, smart recovery, and a greener recovery. And there was a mention of course, our reliance on market-based solutions, but market-based solutions, of course, need the right rules, the right infrastructure, the right policies to actually provide the right incentives. So in that sense, I think governments will have to be ready to meet those challenges, but in strong partnership with stakeholders and strong international coordination. Now, this is about the limit I have in terms of time, I suppose. So just in closing, to discuss all these issues, we are now at the OECD planning to have the next and 7th annual OECD Forum on Green Finance and Investment in October. And we would like to continue those discussions in that forum to enable the green recovery through of course, more sustainable finance. And well, this is critical because, of course, again, I repeat, green recovery is the only way we can hope to have human life survive on this planet in the future. So thank you so much. And in French, you say bonne continuation, and thanks to you all.
And thank you very much. We very much appreciate the partnership with OECD on these dialogues. I'd like to introduce at this point Vanessa Perez-Irera. She's the Deputy Leader of WWF's Climate and Energy Practice. And she's also the energy behind this dialogue series together with your team, Mr. Kuhlow. Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. And I will try to be super, super short. I think you gave a great wrap up of the two previous dialogues that we had, one on NDCs, how these, the delay of COP26 grants governments the big opportunity to enhance NDCs and also to try to align them to a more sustainable post-COVID society. I think the citizens and people are demanding that, and I think governments need to take that cue. Also, nature-based solutions, the big opportunity that grant us to have double or triple dividend investments for rural jobs and job intensity. I'd like to just bring up a slide for the next series of our dialogues. So basically, I'm very, very happy that you, Margaret, Eric, and Martin spoke about the environment and health, and this is exactly the focus of the next series of dialogues. So it's basically how to incorporate measures on the recovery that can focus on increasing people's health through different ways, but of course, how do we invest in nature to avoid future pandemics, and also how we can invest in more healthy food systems and healthier cities, both in terms of natural investments, but also clean air and different behavior change. So these are the three topics. We have clean air on Friday the 26th, human health and food systems on Friday the 3rd of July, and a nature deal, so how to give a push to nature in this 2020-2021 super years, I would say, on Friday, July the 10th. You're very, very welcome to attend. The same registration link that will be sent by Dana after these dialogues. And just to close, thanking really our OECD colleagues for this fantastic and smooth collaboration. I'd also take the opportunity to thank all the team behind the scenes. It has been a very, very intense collective effort, and we really hope that you enjoyed this first series of dialogues and that you will join us for this next series of dialogues. We're partnering with EDF, World Conservation Society, and other organizations for this second series, and of course with our partner OECD. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you again, Vanessa. Thank you again to Minister Morneau, to Martin Spolc, to Eric Usher, to Masamichi Kuhlow, all of you for partnering with us to bring you these dialogues. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, we'll be sending a recording of the event by email to all the registered participants, and we'd like to wish you all a wonderful, peaceful, happy, healthy weekend. Thank you.